Thank you, Josh, and Jennifer, and others of you who have made me already, Linda, so feel so welcome. Thank you, and Mary. Wow, I haven't seen the film in several months. I have seen it many, many times, but not as recently as I might have, because for a while I was seeing it a couple of times a week and going to see it with people like you and listening to your questions and trying to respond. It's very interesting 50 years later to think back on those days and to try to figure out where we are today. Because as I said at Allison Cheek's funeral, and Allison had become one of my dearest friends. She had retired in Brevard too, and so she and I had spent a lot of time in the last 5 years of her life talking about our lives, our ministries, the Philadelphia ordination onward. And she and the other Philadelphia ordinands, and certainly the bishops who ordained us, had all agreed, and would have agreed even then, that the primary point of the Philadelphia ordination was not to make 11 women priests. It was to break open a structure of injustice that in this case involved keeping women out of the priesthood of the Episcopal Church. But there are, as you know, I'm sure, always structures of injustice that need to be broken open, and who better than Christian people in the Jesus movement to do it? And that's where we are today. We have lots of women priests, even quite a few women bishops, which is wonderful. And it does show, things change, there's progress, it's all very wonderful. In many ways, it's great that people don't really know that once upon a time, women were not priests. But on the other hand, it is also important to know our history. So I really appreciate your showing the film, and Margot Guernsey, the filmmaker, who's not an Episcopalian herself and is way younger than I am, and Nikki Bramley, the videographer, also a young woman, not an Episcopalian. It maybe was great that two non-Episcopal women did this, because they had to figure out how to tell this story in such a way that people could understand it, even if they weren't Episcopalians. Because think about our structure and the General Convention and the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies and voting by orders and all of this stuff that is incomprehensible even to those of us who were there. It makes no sense at all to other people. It's a little bit like Congress. In fact, it was put together by the same people 200 years ago. And so they made a film that I think really is pretty comprehensible to people who are interested in these issues, whether or not they're Episcopalians. That's been the feedback we've gotten. And I could sit here and talk for the next 30 or 40 minutes, but I'd much rather hear your questions and respond to them so that the time is what you want it to be.
Yeah. Go ahead, Worth.
Your determination to do this, were you scared? Were you raised to be extra strong? How did you have the courage to step forward on this?
Well, how did we have the courage to step forward, and how did we come to do this? We never would have done it, I believe, had there not been more than one of us. All of us would say, if we were asked that question, that it was the fact that we were together. There were a group of us that we could lean on one another and call each other up. In those days, there were only telephones and the U.S. mail. So we used both a lot. And we lived all over the country, so we couldn't even visit back and forth very much, but we did keep in touch as well as we could. And Sue Hyatt, who is earlier in the film several times, she was a social worker, community organizer by trade, as well as having been to seminary and an Episcopal deacon, and she was working as a community organizer for Bishop DeWitt, one of the four bishops in Pennsylvania. And when both of them were completely and totally committed to the ordination of women priests, and after the church turned it down at the Louisville Convention in 1973, they put their heads together and said, the only way this is ever going to happen is if somebody moves ahead and does it. Because at that moment in the larger society, there was a growing movement against the women's movement. outside the church. Remember Phyllis Schlafly? So that kind of anti-feminist, anti-women's rights movement had taken and was getting stronger, not weaker. And it was like, well, and the church had voted by a larger margin in 1973 than in 1970 not to ordain women. And the real holdouts were the priests. Lay people and bishops were okay in 1973, but the priests weren't, and that was always interesting. It's your own peers. Well, Bishop DeWitt and Sue Hyatt said, we're going to go for it, and DeWitt basically asked Sue to organize it because she knew how to organize. And she understood that so the first principle is you get as many as possible, in every movement. And I would say this today too to all of us, that if we're going to be movements for justice, we need to do it together. Not only in one parish, but in other parishes. In other words, we can't, it's fine for any one of us to take a stand. And that's a wonderful thing. But the more of us that can speak up together or do something like this, the better. So that's really where the impetus and the strength came from. And I had grown up in Hendersonville. I went to Rosa Edwards Elementary School. I was the first child, and my parents were very affirming of me doing or being anything I wanted to be, although my mother had said when I said I want to be a priest, because I was over at St. James there on Main Street, and I just loved the church. And I decided I want to be a priest, and she said, I'm sorry, honey, you can't be a priest. Girls can't be priests. And I thought, oh, that's a little weird. But then there was a lot of stuff that was a little weird in those days, like the fact that we were all white people. And we had black people coming to take care of yards and take care of us. And so there were some weird things. So, but I didn't question it except to say, why does God let it be this way? And she said, well, he doesn't do that. He's not doing it, Well, then why can't we do something about it? Well, we just can't. There's nothing we can do, but it's not God's will. And I remember that message very much as a little girl, but I also remember, and my siblings who came along 6 and 7 years later, remember also that our parents encouraged all three of us to do and be whatever in the world we could and wanted to be. There was no agenda for us as women or men to be like a certain way, to be feminine or masculine, or to do this or not to do that. And that was a huge help. And I have a feeling that most of the other Philadelphia 11, perhaps all of them, had similar messages, which is sort of go for it. We'll support you. And all of our families, those of us who were single, those of us who were married, gay and straight alike, all of us had families who were supporting us. And that was extremely helpful. 28. I was 28.
And you ended up, you have a PhD. I mean, you dedicated yourself to study and a huge amount of intellectual work.
Well, I had even before the Philadelphia ordination and before it became apparent that women priests were going to have an iffy time working in parishes, for example, if ever, I had decided that I did want to work in the field of religion. So I'd been to college and majored in religion and went from college to graduate school to get a degree in theology. So I wound up teaching theology at the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Mass. for 30 years. And I did supply work in parishes, and we also, we had a liturgical life in the seminary, and so I was in the church, but always had the kind of freedom people have when you teach in seminaries or teach in universities. It's why we've all got a bad name today as being too woke, woke and liberal and whatever. Well, maybe we are, but we, those of us who were in the seminary really did try our best to help people make the connections between the Bible and church history and the struggles for right relation, for all kinds of justice as being part of God's movement in the world.
Yeah.
Yes.
How did you all coalesce? How did you meet each other, coalesce, find out you had this common goal, and then go from the idea that you each had in your heart to?
We met really in seminaries. We had gone to seminary, those of us who, there were a couple of the 11 who were not in seminary, but those of us who had been in seminaries had gone because we wanted to do something with religion, in the field of religion, or at least we thought we did. And so I went to Union Seminary in New York, which is interdenominational, and but most of the students at Union, the majority were Episcopalians, and at least half of those were women. And we didn't quite know what we were doing there in terms of the Episcopal Church, because none of us had been sort of blessed by our bishops and told to go to seminary. We were there kind of in spite of that. But quite a few of us said, there's no reason why women can't be ordained. And again, it was more than one of us. And so we were thinking, And then we found out at Virginia Seminary in Alexandria, which is an Episcopal seminary, there were women. Allison Cheek was one of them. Emily Hewitt and Marie Moorfield and I were at Union Seminary. There were women out at the Church School, Divinity School of the Pacific in California. And we met each other at the General Convention, for example, in 1970, but out of that convention, the Episcopal Women's Caucus came into being, and the Episcopal Women's Caucus would meet at least once a year, and its primary mission was to open up ordination of women in the church. And so it was a political movement within the church. So that's how we had met. Yes.
You said you taught in seminary for 30 years.
Mhm.
Is that after your ordination?
Yes.
So I had a question, and maybe you can, through experiences with others. How challenging was it for women who were ordained to be accepted as a priest in a church?
It was challenging, although eventually it did happen. And of the 11 of us, the 15, if you include the Washington group, I would say about half of us wound up working as parish priests, and in a couple of cases were rectors. Nancy Wittig became a rector, for example. Several of the women who have died, who are therefore not in the film, were parish priests, rectors, and the like. But it did take, I would say it took about 10 years for any of us to really get a foothold in a parish that we could call our own.
So what were they doing?
Working, doing whatever jobs they could on the side, but also doing supply work, going and increasingly there were people like Josh and other male priests who would, once women's ordination had been affirmed, it was fine. We were all recognized by our own bishops then, and so we were once suddenly legal. And once it was legal to have us come, there was no reason why you would not have had me come and supply in the summer when you're on vacation, things like that. So women, all of us were being invited to help in parishes when we were needed. And so a lot did that. And by this time, of course, lots of women were beginning to be ordained. And those women, I think women would say even to this day, there's some resistance on the part of some parishes and some dioceses to hire women, particularly as the rector. There's a sense, as you all know, I see all these heads nodding, that somehow in a patriarchal church and world order, it makes more visual sense or something, more sort of gut level sense for there to be a man as the head and a woman as the assistant. And so for 20 or 30 years, that was the norm. Male rectors or vicars and women assisting. And then that did change. And then, as you saw, there were all these women bishops now. And fascinatingly enough, and any number of the women bishops are black women. Not just Barbara Harris, but any number of black women have been ordained, have been consecrated as bishops.
Patrice has one.
Yeah, judging from watching the film, the animosity and dislike of this whole concept was palpable.
Yes.
Was there ever a time that you were afraid?
Yes. Was there ever a time we were afraid? Yes, I think in the film there's a fair amount of attention being paid to the security around the Philadelphia ordination itself, which was, dogs were sent in to sniff out for bombs because there had been threats. And we had, they had offered us bulletproof vest to wear at the ordination, and we had said no to that. Although Barbara Harris did have on a bulletproof vest at her consecration, that beautiful consecration that we just saw. She and a number of the principal characters in that consecration had on bulletproof attire. But we had the odd and wonderful motley crew of the Philadelphia Police, the Black Panthers, and the radical lesbians working together as bodyguards at the Philadelphia ordination. And they were working just fine. It was like the realm of God, It was like, this is the way it's supposed to be, that everybody gets to, that's common ground. So yeah, there were, and Sue Hyatt again, and Bishop DeWitt, who knew more about what was going on than any of us, as well as Paul Washington, the rector of that church, had all said, yeah, we're getting all kinds of threats, and so we're going to make sure these women and this church, their presenters and everybody else are kept safe. So I think we knew only the tiniest bit of what was actually being done to keep us safe. I personally, I don't recall any instance in which I myself have been terribly afraid. There are times when I'm somewhat cautious, particularly if you know that there's somebody angry in a congregation. Back in those days, however, it felt much less likely that somebody would suddenly get up and start shooting people. And these days, you just have to wonder, because it would not simply be me if somebody came in here. It would be all of us. And that's a horrible realization. You just hate to feel like your presence is jeopardizing other people. But there again, you have to just assume that because we're together, we're a pretty mighty force right here in this room, and would be. And that always gives me hope and strength and courage.
Danielle has one.
Okay, was there ever any time where you guys doubted what you were doing would work, and how did you overcome that?
Y'all are just great with your questions. Well, we didn't know right from the get-go whether or not we would ever really be accepted. We just thought this has to happen, because until this happens, the church is not going to move forward in a positive way. Now, we may have been wrong about that. You were asking me before this session, might it have happened without the Philadelphia ordination? Well, yeah, you never can tell what might have happened. We all thought that was doubtful because of the way the society was moving against women's rights. And the church is part of the society. We're shaped by the same forces. But we personally thought, we don't know whether or not we'll ever be accepted by anybody. And we were assured by some people that we wouldn't be, and probably never have been. I don't know all the people that have been out there rejecting me and the others all these years, but I'm sure they're there. So I guess all of us were kind of making contingency plans, and my contingency plan wasn't all that contingent. It was that I had the honor of being able to work in a seminary that was celebrating women priests right from including the Philadelphia 11, right from the beginning. So I probably had an easier road to walk than a lot of my sister priests did, but none of us were sure that we would ever be accepted. Yes.
We talked about this earlier, but there were a lot of horrible things said by priests, lay people, and did you have time, or were there events where people came back and tried to apologize or reconcile themselves to this change in the church?
Yes, they did. Some did, and some didn't. And probably all of us had the experience of having some of the opponents to women's ordination approach us later and say they had changed their minds, or that they were really sorry that they had done what they did or said what they said, or had not been there for us when we needed them and stuff like that. And I would assume that my sister priest and I all have attempted to be as welcoming and gracious as possible, because we understand that we're all human and we change as we can, and we do our best, most of us, most of the time. And but certainly there were people, as you know, who left the church, and who some formed the Anglican Church in North America, which has a parish over in Mills River. Some went to the Roman Catholic Church. Some stayed in the Episcopal Church, but just were miserable about the fact that there were all these women priests running around. And throughout our ministry, we've always been to the extent that we've been in parish ministry, there have always been some people who've made it very clear that they'd rather not have us there. I haven't had that experience that much because I haven't been in parishes that much as a priest. But those who have said men would come over, and not just men either. Women can be just as sexist as men. But people would come up and just clearly avoid taking communion from a woman, for example. Would just wait until the man came along and then step up and take it. Stuff like that. So you just, you have to remember all the people who are really glad you're there and try to be kind to everybody, if not all that pleasant sometimes, because we have to take up for one another. Yes?
You've had a very impressive life so far. I'm interested in what you do today. Are you still involved in the hierarchy of the church?
No, I have not been very much involved in the church since I left the divinity school in the late 90s, early 2000s. When I moved to Brevard, I moved with some other people, and we bought some property actually between Cedar Mountain and Brevard. And I set about helping found Free Rein Therapeutic Riding Center, which is a horse equine therapy, right, which exists, and it's just great. It's going, it's wonderful over in Brevard. It has about 200 kids and adults every session and hundreds of volunteers. And I once upon a time was one of the instructors and helped train horses and whatever, but all of which I learned to do when I got here. I had loved horses as a child. I was one of those little girls who had the horse gene, I guess, but I had never had a horse until I got to Brevard. And so I had to learn it all sort of from scratch. So that became, like in the year 2000, 2001, that was my energy and my passion. I went to St. Philip's over in Brevard for a couple of years, and then left there when the whole Gene Robinson or consecration of the gay male bishop took place. And the worlds are small because his wife, Boo McDaniel, had trained me as a therapeutic horseback riding person. And so I had known Gene, the man who became the bishop, and his then wife, because he was at one time married and the father of 2 daughters. I had known them personally up in New Hampshire. So you know how when something happens to one of your friends, you take it personally. And not only was I offended by what happened in the church about the consecration of a gay man, but personally I found it very difficult because Boo and Jean had been friends of mine. So anyhow, at St. Philip's, a bunch of us were together in 2002 and 2003 trying to raise up the issue of LGBT people in the church. And St. Philip's at that time would have no part of it. So we left and formed a mission up in Cedar Mountain, St. Clair, and that went on for almost 15 years. We were kind of on the edge of the Episcopal Church. We had very good relationship with Bishop Johnson, who was the bishop at the time, and then with Porter Taylor, who came along. But we never tried to become an official parish because we were from all over. Some of us were Episcopalians, some were Quakers, some were Presbyterians. We were a hodgepodge of Christians and sometimes Christians. And since then, I have not had a steady parish connection. I go to St. Philip's some now. I regard the people there and the clergy there very highly. And I think it's a wonderful parish. But I have also attached myself to the Unitarian Universalist Church in Brevard. And when asked, I call myself a Christian Universalist who happens to be an Episcopal priest. And it really does make good sense spiritually, because I love Jesus and the Jesus movement and the Jesus story and sharing at communion, but I also believe that it's so much bigger than we Christians tend to think of it. That it really is, that at heart it really is a universal movement for grace and for justice and for peace and so forth. So I'm on the boundary. And I've also worked a lot with the NAACP in Brevard and continue to support Free Reign. I learned to play the fiddle, and not very well, so you would never want to hear me do it, but it was learning to ride horses and play the fiddle were my retirement activities. And I do some writing, and I'm working right now as hard as I can to figure out how to help keep bad things from taking place in our society. Worse things taking place in our society, and because I'm one of the safe ones personally. An old white woman is not likely to be a victim of too much bad stuff in the United States or anywhere else, but collectively we are in serious trouble, and our younger people are. And so but I was saying to some people the other day that I consider my vocation right now to be someone who helps bring hope, to keep hope alive, because I think that's what we have to do, is not let ourselves be pulled into the mire and get in despair, because love, justice love, will win someday. Yes?
This is probably the most asked question, but what was the most challenging part of going, and doing the whole, acceptance thing?
Doing,
Going through and, being ordained.
yeah. Well, it's hard. If you like people to like you, it's hard to know that so many people don't. And to be called, we're all called these terrible names, but again, thanks to the fact that we had each other, after a while it was like, oh my goodness, did you hear what he said? Or did you realize what she said? And so you get used to it. It's not that you like it. It's not that it's okay that people are calling you terrible names, or think they are at least. Sometimes they're calling you what they think are bad names, but you think, well, are we angry women? I mean, that was one of the worst things they would say about us, that we were angry women tearing the church apart. And we had to look at each other and say, well, we actually are pretty angry. But we're angry about certain things. We're not tearing the church apart, or as Barbara Harris says to the person who phoned the morning of the Philadelphia ordination, who says, you're going to tear this church right apart if you ordain those women. And Barbara said, church is already torn apart. That's why we're doing it. And so that's the kind of thing we had to help remind each other, is that if we were angry, it was for a reason. And angry people don't need to be violent people. You just need to use the anger in a loving way and try to help, try to do something positive with it.
My mother used to call it righteous indignation.
Righteous indignation, indeed. And there's always room for that.
When's the last time you preached a sermon?
Oh, so I
The
preach.
reason I asked, we have an opening here in our church.
We're hiring an associate.
Oh my goodness. Well, I've done quite a bit of preaching over the last 2 or 3 years. I still do that. I will go preach places.
Yeah, and people hosted the film and wanted you to come.
Yeah, come there and preach the next day, or when you go off to Indianapolis or something to respond to the film and you're there on a Sunday morning, they usually say, would you say something? So there's a hand back here.
I was thinking back to the naysayers. What kind of rationale did people give? I mean, it just seems, in retrospect, to be so obvious that it should be. So what kind of rationale, seemingly legitimate rationale, did people give against the movement?
Well, I think there were several different streams of negativity. One were the people, can we talk about, would you like to tell the folks about George?
Okay.
This is Jennifer, she's
So-
wonderful Jennifer.
Okay. So I sort of knew a little bit about the story, but not as much as I've subsequently learned. But my uncle is a Catholic priest in New York State, and he's retired now. But when I knew he had left the Episcopal Church over the issue of women's ordination. What I did not realize was how actively he was involved in the opposition until I saw the documentary in Brevard, and he was one of the people speaking at the ordination service in opposition. His name is George Rutler. poor Rosanna thought I was like having a seizure, I think, because I didn't know what was going on. And so I was shocked that it was to that degree. George ultimately did leave the Episcopal Church in, I believe it was 79, over the issue of the ordination of women, and he became a Catholic priest and was accepted in the Catholic Church in 81. And he served in the Catholic Church for the rest of his life. And so his viewpoint was very much that it was not the appropriate role for women, that God was the Father and Jesus was man, and therefore the priest had to follow in that as well. And I mean, I don't want to speak for him, but I know he would still affirm that today is his belief system. So I actually got to meet Reverend Heyward after in the showing in Brevard and introduced myself and explained the connection. And I don't know, it was an amazing moment for me, at least. I don't know. So.
Well, yes, and, it's, our families are just really interesting. And, probably everybody in the room knows that from one family member or another, but it's, and George Rutler and I were, you could not have been more adversarial than the two of us were toward each other personally, not just in the Philadelphia ordination, but he and I had been in seminary at the same time, and he had been in an Episcopal seminary down the way in New York City, and I'd been at Union up the way, and he and I had met several times, and he wanted nothing to do with me. He thought that I represented the most despicable forces on the planet. So I think, to your question, there's some people, like George Rutler, for whom this is a serious matter of what they believe about God and the world. And, I believe they're wrong, and he believes we're wrong. And, fortunately, this world can be, and at its best is a large enough place for all of us to find a place to be where we can feel at home. Other people, and those people have a whole worldview. If you had George Rutler or anybody like George Rutler speaking here now, you'd find him to be a pleasant, intelligent man who would present a very different worldview probably than anybody in this parish. Now, maybe not, but I would guess that if you're here to begin with, you probably wouldn't agree with Father Rutler's theology. But there is that. Then there are people who I think just have an emotional reaction against women in leadership that is not even theological. It's like just don't want women to be equal to men in a way that you have to really deal with it. That somehow female power is scary to them. And those people, quite a few of them have come around over time, because they wound up having daughters or nieces or mothers, for that matter, who said, "What are you thinking?" And who can help people like that grow and change and become less frightened.
The reason I asked is when I raised my hand and said I wanted to be an Acolyte in 1970.
Right.
There was no rationale. Right. It was just like, no, it's not. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
It hasn't been done. It will not be done. It shouldn't be. That was the only legitimate. Well, that was not illegitimate answer. That's the only answer I got.
Well, and that
It was troubling.
yes, and it is troubling, and that is like rationale for anything unjust, really. It's like what my parents said to me when I asked them about why our black maid couldn't play with her children in our yard in Hendersonville back in 1950. And my parents said, it's just not done. It's just not, and I said, why? Well, it's just not done. Well, but why is that? And it's like children get right at that. Why?
Absolutely.
Why? Why do these people live over here and these people live over here? And if adults don't know, and all they can say is, we don't know. And I can remember asking, in terms of race, asking my parents when I was 5 or 6 whether God wanted. I remember I was asking why only white people were at St. James back in 1950. And my parents were saying, well, I said, is that the way God wants it? And I can remember they said, no, that's not God's will. I said, well, then why? Why does God let it happen? Well, we've got to do something. Well, what can we do? Well, there's nothing we can do. So it's that, why are things the way they are? Well, they just are that way. But that's why, and I try in everything I do and teach, I try to point out yes, there are courageous individuals who rise up and help us do what is right, but primarily it's courageous communities that decide, okay, this is the time that we're going to move on this, and we're going to get people from among us who have various talents to help us out. Some speak, some write, some organize, but we as a group are going to take a stand so that it's no longer okay to say, well, we don't know why it's that way. It doesn't have to be that way.
We better, I'm just looking at the time, and I would love to, on some level, skip the 11 o'clock and just keep hearing this conversation. But yeah, we're about 5 minutes till now. So I'm going to sprint over there. And Reverend Heyward might be willing to just mingle with you guys for a little bit, and Jennifer can maybe see her out. But we are so grateful for you. You said that you feel like your calling is to hope, and I feel more aware of the hope that God has for all of us with this conversation. So thank you for your work and for your presence here. Thank you so much.